Hello, my name is Amanda, and these are my group members.
Albina.
Hamzid.
Jody.
Jason.
And today we're going to be discussing the ineffective, inaccurate cycle of American standardized testing and why drastic changes have to be made to the current system. In 1922, not even 2 decades after the first American standardized exam was created, philosopher John Dewey issued a warning about classifying students using intelligence tests. A few years later, this sentiment would be echoed by a United States Bureau of Education survey, followed by many more critics. Despite consistent opposition, these tests remained due to their supposed objective approach to measuring education, and standardized testing continued to be, well, standard. Standardized testing is still an extremely prevalent force in the United States, but significant arguments have been made against their effectiveness. It's impossible for standardized tests to objectively, equally, and accurately measure every student's capability. Therefore, this practice needs to be replaced. There are countless substitutes for the American testing system that are already running smoothly around the world, and many existing alternatives for our current stressful cycle of standardized tests.
Thanks, Amanda. So what exactly is standardized testing? When I think of standardized testing, I think back to my high school career, when standardized testing was most paramount. I think of long nights of studying, butterflies in the stomach, and this overwhelming sense of dread towards the fact that I have to test, again. Like many of you, I've done standardized testing for as long as I can remember. In high school specifically, standardized testing was a common aspect of life. As a former high school student, I've studied for many years for the APs, SATs, and more. And during that entire time, I always wondered when it was going to end. Unfortunately, as students in general, we cannot escape our fates. We have to take standardized tests at one point or another. As a result, we cannot help but wonder, how standard are these standardized tests? What exactly do they measure, if they measure anything at all? Today, I'm going to answer these questions specifically in regards to the US. First, let's talk about how common standardized testing is. Standardized tests have been around for a very long time. I remember when I was in early elementary school, I took my first CSAP, or the statewide test in Colorado. Then I fast forward several years and I got into high school and took my first ever AP exams and SATs. And I know that I'm not the only American student who has gone through a similar journey either. Standardized tests are so common, in fact, that according to a 2017 updated Teach Thought article written by the staff, there is not one, but a total of 16 standardized tests in education today, such as the APs and SATs, like I mentioned earlier, and if you're thinking about graduate school, MCATs, the tests for medical school, LSATs, the tests for law school, and more. Second, standardized tests are not only common, but also so important that the government is willing to spend a lot of money on them. According to a 2012 report by Matthew M. Chingos of the Brown Center on Education Policy at Brookings, states nationwide spend upwards of roughly $1.7 billion on assessments each year. We as students have to spend money on these tests as well. Remember when you had to pay to register to take your SAT or ACT? As we can see, standardized testing is a big deal in the US. The variety of tests and the monetary emphasis from the government, we can be sure that standardized tests are useful. However, are they actually? I want to finally discuss what exactly standardized tests measure for them to be so essential to the average American student's academic career. We may think that standardized tests measure the same thing, but in reality, they don't. According to a 2015 updated page by the Glossary of Education Reform, there are several kinds of standardized tests, such as the achievement tests, aptitude tests, and college admission tests. The college admission tests are the most self-explanatory. They are the SATs and ACTs, where they determine where you can go to college. According to the same page by the Glossary of Education Reform, achievement tests measure the knowledge and skills students learned in school, and aptitude tests predict a student's ability to succeed in an intellectual or physical endeavor by evaluating certain skills. Obviously, standardized tests run the gamut, and therefore aren't the one and the same. Ultimately, as students, especially for high school students, we have to take a standardized test at least once in our school journeys. Since we take multiple in our lifetimes too, we may think that all of them basically measure the same thing when they actually don't. Moreover, with such an emphasis on these tests, the country spends over $1 billion on them. thus highlighting their universality and importance.
So, standardized testing is basically universal throughout the United States, and it's costly too. Now, the question is whether all of that time and money spent on countless standardized exams is beneficial, accurate, and worthwhile.
And that's where I come in to answer that question. Before anything, though, I want to say it from someone's perspective who fell asleep while taking the SAT that standards testing does not, in fact, measure how smart you actually are. And my statement, in fact, is backed up by my science and research. First, let's talk about the formatting of standards testing or the SAT. You get a Scantron and an answer sheet. From the answer sheet, you have four answer choices and you have to pick one of them and have the 25% chance of getting it right. Well, what does that do to you? According to Health and Resource Service Administration, that form of testing lowers your critical thinking and gives you a low level learning objective. Just because standards testing or the multiple choice is more about remembering or sometimes understanding, and it's not about creating or evaluating. Also, the result is based on reading and comprehension, not about critical thinking, organizing, and applying that in real world. Not only that, standardized testing is also a measurement of how wealthy you are. A report from the Washington Post clearly shows that students who are from richer families have much higher score than students who are from poorer families. If we look at the graph on the very left, we can see that the highest score from families that earn more than 200,000 a year have much higher score than students who are from families that earn less money compared to those. Also, ethnicity and parental education plays a very big role. And now, why is that? Well, according to the CBNC website, three factors that plays that big role in that issue is number one, cost. Students who are from richer families have the option to take the SAT that costs $60 each over and over compared to students who can only afford one or two times. Academic support also plays a big role. Students who are wealthy tend to go to schools that are very well funded compared to students who are poorer don't. And those well-funded schools have a lot of college prep opportunities such as the PSAT. It is statistically proven that the PSAT, students who take the PSAT before taking the actual SAT have much higher scores than the students who don't take the PSAT at all. And lastly, extra time. Um, Students who have the accommodation to have extra time in the SAT are oftentimes diagnosed with ADHD or other stuff. And those diagnoses or doctor's note can be retrieved from a physician. And oftentimes poorer families don't have the opportunity or the accessibility to go to a physician who could write them such notes. Also, the stress that comes with standards testing. A study from the National Bureau of Economic Research shows that students who are taking the test have 15% higher cholesterol rate than students who are not taking a standardized testing. If we look at the graph on the very right and analyze the blue curve, we can clearly see that the rate shifts to the right a little bit. And if we look at the maximum point of that and compare that to the performance anxiety curve, we see that the maximum point is actually does fall under the too much stress or overload zone, proving that standard testing does cause a lot of stress among students. Also, to add on to that, the California State University shows that testing in general affects students' self-confidence if they score low, if there's low scoring students. It also takes away students' creativity and students' motivation. And it does create test anxiety, and some of which symptoms are disappointment, anger, helplessness, and fear. And to sum it all up, I came up with this acronym BRB, be right back, just kidding. The B stands for the bubble sheet, which is an ineffective way to measure a student's merit. The R in the middle stands for riches, which stands for the measurement of how rich students are rather than how brilliant they are. And the last B stands for breakdown or the mental issues and mental complication that comes with too much testing or the standardized testing methods. With all that being said, that sums up my part of the presentation, and I'll hand over this to Amanda.
Thank you. So these tests are designed in a way that makes it impossible for many students to excel at them. Standardized testing in the United States is clearly a biased, inaccurate measuring tool that has to be improved. But are we alone? Are students in other countries also struggling with compulsory, ineffective standardized testing?
Thanks, Amanda. Now I want the audience to close your eyes and imagine a world where standardized testing is not mandatory. Can you imagine the relief you would feel knowing that you wouldn't have to spend months preparing and studying for a standardized test? Well, in some countries, such as Finland, standardized testing is completely voluntary, whereas in other countries, standardized testing is taken very seriously and often throughout the year. Every country does standardized testing vastly differently, and I think the United States could draw some inspiration and adapt change from how other countries mandate standardized tests. Each student takes tests very differently from one another, so it would make sense that each country does it differently from one another as well. According to Insider, China was the first country to make their students take standardized tests in hopes that it would level out the playing field in education. Since then, countries all over the world have developed their own versions of standardized testing for students to take. However, each country's standardized tests differ from one another. My goal today is to highlight some of the ways that the United States can learn from other countries' standardized testing. I'm sure we are all familiar with standardized testing in the United States, but what many of you may not realize is how frequently we were tested throughout the school year. Each state does standardized testing differently, but the US requires students to take at least one standardized test per year. According to the Washington Post, an average student has taken 112 standardized tests by the time they have graduated high school. This includes AP exams, SATs, ACTs, and exams mandated by each state. According to Big Think, students in Finland are only offered one standardized test and is completely voluntary. What student wouldn't want to do that? The standardized test is offered at the end of senior year and is called the National Matriculation Examination. Although it is voluntary, it is still important for students to do well, but there is less stress on students compared to those in other countries. Finland allows the teachers to choose how they want to test their students, and many teachers stress the importance of letting children learn from the real world instead of textbooks. Internationally, Finland is ranked very high in education. According to the Smithsonian Magazine, in 2009, Finland ranked second in science, third in reading, and sixth in math. This picture here compares Finland's education to the United States. Clearly, the lack of standardized testing has no impact on how well students are learning, as education in Finland is ranked higher than the United States. Each country does standardized testing very differently, but I think I can speak for all students when I say that it is very appealing the way standardized testing is offered in Finland. If voluntary testing works for Finland and they are ranked very high in international education rankings, why wouldn't it work for the United States as well?
So in Finland, though they may not have necessarily ensured that no students are at disadvantages while taking exams, they've alleviated a lot of the stress placed upon students through endless standardized tests in the creation of a single voluntary exam. The United States can take inspiration from Finland and other countries for how to better administer standardized tests in a way that benefits those taking them. So how can we improve the current situation in our country?
While standardized tests are the most widespread and recognized form of assessing a student's ability in our country, are there other, possibly better methods to do so? That is the question I'm here to answer. Now, what are the alternatives we have to standardized testing? Well, according to American University, two alternative solutions to standardized testing are game-based assessments and performance portfolio-based assessments. Game-based assessments are video game-like assessments. They are meant to get at higher order thinking skills by having the taker play games that aim to test systems thinking, ability to take feedback, creativity, teamwork, etc. The reason these kinds of assessments may be effective is that a large portion of teens, about 97%, aged 12 to 17, regularly play video games. So it will be very easy to test teens in that age range. Some examples of these tests are those made by Glass Labs and the AAA lab at Stanford, or SimCity EDU by Measure Systems Thinking. and other tests too. Now, how about performance portfolio-based assessments? These are assessments that take into a wider account of a student's performance. This type of assessment tracks a student's performance on projects, presentations, papers, reports, etc., and looks at the portfolios of work collected over a long period of time. This means the student's progress, effort, and improvement would all be measured and can give a more accurate representation of their overall performance. Examples of schools that use this kind of assessment can be found on the New York Performance Standards Consortium. These kinds of assessments also don't need students to interrupt their learning in order to be tested. Also, according to the National Public Radio, another alternative form of assessment is a stealth assessment. These kinds of assessments are accomplished with software that allows students to practice math and English. The software allows the students' mastered skills to be seen, as well as the students' pattern of answers to be analyzed. While this is somewhat similar to game-based assessments, the software used for stealth assessments are not always necessarily game-like, but may just be a website that lets students practice math questions. Examples of these software can be seen from companies such as Khan Academy, Dreambox, or Scholastic. By analyzing how students answer their questions, we can obtain insight into how quickly they learn something, how diligent they are, etc. These assessments are able to passively collect data on students' knowledge over a long period of time, providing a more accurate picture of their improvement. Also, this kind of assessment will still need more work to be done and research, as the software involved is still very new. In conclusion, these assessments, game-based assessments, performance portfolio-based assessments, and stealth assessments are some alternatives to standardized tests that may be more accurate and effective. It is important to remember, though, that these tests are not all completely researched and worked out. So more research will need to be done in order to evaluate their effectiveness and refine them further.
So, not only have these standardized tests been shown to cost states billions of dollars, but they cost students a lot of time, money, and misery. Additionally, these tests disproportionately favor certain demographics of students over others. And while standardized testing looks very different around the world, America is not the only country subjecting its students to high-intensity, crucial standardized tests. In summary, the current system of standardized testing in the United States is inaccurate, biased, and overwhelming. To remedy this, the United States could implement one of the many solutions displayed earlier by Jason, but the most obvious resolution would be to take inspiration from Finland and decrease the amount of required standardized tests. Many colleges have already begun to move away from these exams, with many universities becoming test optional. According to the Washington Post, because research has consistently shown that ACT and SAT scores are strongly linked to students' familial incomes, maternal education levels, and race, more and more colleges are ending these test scores as an admission requirement. Throughout the 2018 to 2019 school year alone, more than 50 accredited colleges and universities announced that they would be dropping the requirement for entrance exams, and that number continues to increase every year. Standardized testing can be very beneficial when done correctly. However, research has shown that these tests use a clearly flawed methodology, and the tests do not give every student the same opportunity to excel at them. Additionally, regardless of students' performances on these exams, the large amount of pressure placed on students to repeatedly take these tests is not worth the inaccurate payoff of their results. Standardized testing must be altered in the United States to give all students an equal opportunity to continue their education.